September 3rd, 1940. The village of Alderworth, Kent. 23 miles from the English Channel. Arthur Pemberton stood in the parish-hall, facing 17 men who thought he'd lost his mind. The map spread across the table showed every road, every field, every hedge line within 5 miles. And covering that map, drawn in red pencil with obsessive detail, was a network of lines and symbols that looked like the work of a lunatic. The Home Guard captain, a retired major named Douglas Crawford, stared at the map with barely concealed contempt. "Mr. Pemberton, this is madness. You're proposing we turn the entire countryside into a death trap." Arthur didn't flinch. He was 61 years old, too old for service, with hands scarred from 40 years of engineering work. He'd spent his life designing industrial machinery, solving problems that other men said were impossible. Now, with German invasion expected any day, he'd applied that same mind to a different kind of problem. How do you stop an army with nothing but farmers, shopkeepers, and cleverness? Major Crawford continued, his voice dripping with the kind of certainty that comes from military training and class privilege. "The German army is the most modern fighting force in the world. They've conquered France in 6 weeks. They won't be stopped by rabbit snares and trip wires." Arthur looked at the 17 men. They were the Alderworth Home Guard, farmers, a blacksmith, 2 teachers, a butcher, a postal clerk, average age 53, armed with shotguns, old rifles, and a handful of grenades that probably wouldn't detonate. These men weren't soldiers. They were going to die if the Germans came, unless someone gave them an advantage that doctrine and courage couldn't provide. "The Germans won't be stopped by courage either," Arthur said quietly. "But they can be stopped by mathematics." Crawford's face reddened. "Mathematics? This is warfare, not a university lecture." Arthur tapped the map. "Every army moves through terrain. They follow roads because roads are faster than fields. They use natural routes because that's basic tactics. They concentrate at bridges and crossroads because that's where logistics demands they go. We can't beat them in open combat. We're not trained for that. But we can make the routes they need to use into kill zones. We can turn their own doctrine against them." One of the farmers, Thomas Wickham, leaned forward. "How?" Arthur's finger traced a road on the map. "This is the main route from the coast toward London. If the Germans invade at Dover or Folkestone, they'll use this road. It's the most direct route, best surface for vehicles. Now, look at the terrain. The road passes through a cutting here, with high banks on both sides. Then it crosses Wickham's Creek on a stone bridge. Then it enters a stretch of woodland that's maybe 400 yards long. That entire kilometre of road is a natural killing ground if we prepare it correctly." Crawford was listening, now, despite himself. "What kind of preparation?" Arthur pulled out a notebook filled with sketches and calculations. "We create a system, not random traps, but an integrated defensive network that channels enemy movement exactly where we want it. First, we make the obvious routes impassable. We mine the bridge, not to destroy it immediately, but to destroy it when we choose. We fell trees across the road in the woodland, but we do it in a way that forces vehicles to slow down and navigate obstacles. We make them predictable." He flipped to another page. "Then we exploit that predictability. The cutting with the high banks becomes an ambush site. We position men on the banks with clear fields of fire down into the road. We prepare Molotov cocktails, petrol bombs that burn vehicles. We create escape routes for our men so they can attack and withdraw before the enemy can respond. The Germans will be trapped in a confined space, taking fire from elevated positions, unable to maneuver." "But that's just one section of road," Crawford objected. "They'll go around." Arthur smiled grimly. "That's the beauty of the system, Major. We make every alternate route worse. We flood fields to create obstacles. We create false obstacles that look dangerous but aren't. forcing enemy engineers to waste time clearing them. We use real obstacles at carefully chosen points. We make the main road look like the best option, even though it's a trap. We're not trying to stop the entire German army. We're trying to make this particular stretch of countryside so costly, so time-consuming, that it slows their advance and causes casualties disproportionate to the force defending it. Thomas Wickham spoke up. Arthur's talking about my land. That creek, those woodlands. I know every inch of that ground. I've farmed it for 30 years. If he says we can turn it into a trap, I believe him. Crawford looked at the map, then at Arthur, then at the 17 men waiting for a decision. They were scared. Britain was scared. The entire country expected invasion. The army was still recovering from Dunkirk. The Home Guard was a desperate improvisation, civilians playing soldier because there was no alternative. And here was this village engineer proposing something that sounded insane, but somehow made sense. Crawford made a decision that would haunt him and save him in equal measure. Mr. Pemberton, you have 1 week. Show me this system of yours. If it works, we'll implement it. If it's madness, we'll prepare conventional defenses. But I'm warning you, if Germans die in your traps, their reprisals will be brutal. Arthur met his eyes. Major, if Germans reach this village and we haven't slowed them down, reprisals won't matter because we'll all be dead. I'd rather die trying something clever than die following doctrine that leaves us no chance. Arthur Pemberton hadn't always been a village engineer. He'd started his career in Sheffield in 1898, an apprentice in the steel industry. When Britain was the workshop of the world, he'd learned metalworking, machine design, and most importantly, systems thinking. How individual components interact to create outcomes greater than the sum of their parts. He'd spent 20 years designing industrial equipment. Presses, conveyor systems, safety mechanisms. Equipment that had to work reliably under stress, that had to fail safely when it did fail. That had to be maintained by ordinary workers without extensive training. In 1921, he'd moved to Alderworth for his health. The doctors said the clean country air would help his lungs, damaged by years breathing steel dust. He'd set up a small workshop, doing repairs and custom fabrication for local farms, built plows, fixed tractors, designed irrigation systems. It was quiet work, satisfying work, using his mind to solve practical problems for people he knew. He'd never expected to apply those skills to killing human beings. But when war came in 1939, Arthur watched the news with growing horror. Poland crushed, Denmark and Norway overrun. France, mighty France with its enormous army, and Maginot Line, defeated in 6 weeks. Britain stood alone. The government spoke bravely about fighting on the beaches and never surrendering. But Arthur could do mathematics. Germany had more men, more tanks, more planes. If they invaded, Britain's only hope was to make that invasion so costly, so slow, so grinding that German logistics couldn't sustain it. That meant defense in depth, making every mile of British territory expensive to take. The army would defend key positions, but there weren't enough soldiers to defend everything. That's where the Home Guard came in, not to win battles, but to make the Germans pay for every crossroad, every bridge, every village. Arthur realized that his skills in designing systems, in thinking about how components interact, could be applied to defensive warfare. A well-designed defensive network could multiply the effectiveness of untrained men enormously. He started studying military engineering. Read everything he could find in the village library about fortifications, obstacles, and traps. Studied accounts of the Great War, of sieges throughout history, of any situation where a weaker force had used terrain and preparation to offset enemy strength. He realized that modern militaries had become dependent on mobility, on moving fast, on logistics. Anything that slowed them down, that forced them to deploy infantry instead of just rolling through with armor, that disrupted their timetables, was valuable. The system Arthur designed for Alderworth was based on three principles. First, channel enemy movement through predictable routes by making alternatives impassable or dangerous. Second, prepare those routes with layered obstacles and ambush positions that inflict casualties while allowing defenders to escape. Third, create sustainability, so the same positions could be used repeatedly or abandoned if overwhelmed. It was engineering applied to combat, using terrain and preparation as force multipliers. The first week of preparation was chaos. Arthur had 17 Home Guards members, 3 of whom had any military experience, and 1 week to prove his concept. They started with the simplest elements. Felling trees across roads in the woodland section. Not random trees, but specific ones Arthur had marked. Cut so they'd fall in a pattern that forced vehicles to slow to walking pace and follow a winding route that exposed them to observation. Thomas Wickham used his farm tractor to excavate positions on the high banks of the road cutting. Not trenches, which would be obvious, but small depressions behind natural cover, each position with a clear field of fire and a concealed withdrawal route. Arthur designed simple wooden frames that could hold multiple Molotov cocktails and rotate to dump them on command. A mechanical system operated by a single rope pull, 6 positions, each with 4 to 6 petrol bombs ready to deploy. The bridge over Wickham's Creek required more sophistication. Arthur studied the structure carefully. It was old stone, built in 1760, designed for horse carts, not modern trucks. The Germans would use it if it was intact, but they could also ford the creek if the bridge was destroyed too early. Arthur's solution was controllable demolition. He placed explosives at key structural points, enough to collapse the bridge, but with fuses that could be initiated remotely by lighting a prepared train of black powder. Crude, but effective. By the end of the week, the system was in place. Major Crawford walked the entire route with Arthur, seeing firsthand how the pieces fit together. The approach roads had subtle obstacles that would slow reconnaissance. The woodland section with felled trees created a natural choke point. The road cutting was an ambush site with 6 fire positions and prepared Molotov delivery systems. The bridge could be blown on command, and beyond the bridge, additional obstacles and fighting positions extended the defensive depth another half-mile. Crawford stood on the high bank, looking down at the road. If a German column enters this section, and we execute correctly, they'll be trapped. First vehicle reaches the bridge and either crosses or stops because they suspect demolition. Either way, they're in the killing zone. We hit them with petrol bombs and small arms from elevated positions. They can't advance through the felled trees without dismounting. They can't retreat easily because follow-on vehicles are packed into the approach. And by the time they organize a response, we've withdrawn through our prepared routes. How many casualties could we inflict? Crawford asked. Arthur did the mathematics in his head. Depends on the size of the column. A reinforced platoon, maybe 40 men and 6 vehicles. We could kill or wound half before they organize. A company, the numbers scale similarly. We're not trying to wipe them out, Major. We're trying to make this stretch of road expensive, cost them time, vehicles, and men. Make their commanders cautious about using roads through defended villages. Change their operational calculus. Crawford looked at the 61-year-old engineer with newfound respect. Mr. Pemberton, you've built a killing machine disguised as countryside. Let's hope we never have to use it. But if we do, I want you there to oversee its operation. Arthur nodded slowly. He designed industrial safety systems that saved workers from dangerous machinery. Now he designed a system to feed German soldiers into a mechanical death trap. The irony wasn't lost on him, but neither was the necessity. If the Germans came, this system would kill efficiently. And every German killed here was one less threatening London, one less to fight his country. September 19, 1940. The German invasion didn't come. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's plan to invade Britain, had been postponed indefinitely. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority in the Battle of Britain, and without control of the skies, a seaborne invasion would be suicide. Britain had been given a reprieve. The Home Guard stood down from maximum alert. Life in Alderworth slowly returned to something approaching normal. But Arthur's defensive system remained in place. And that's when things got interesting in ways nobody expected. The system Arthur had built wasn't just a passive defense, it could be activated selectively. Individual elements could be used independently or in combination. And as Arthur continued to refine his design through the autumn of 1940, he realized that the same principles could be applied offensively. Not to stop an invasion, but to harass and destroy German forces that did operate in Britain. The Germans might not invade with a full army, but they were conducting operations. Commando raids on coastal targets, aircrew from shot-down bombers trying to evade capture, spy networks operating in southern England, intelligence-gathering missions, small-scale operations that Britain's conventional forces couldn't efficiently counter. But a network of well-prepared traps, operated by locals who knew every inch of terrain, could be devastatingly effective against these small German incursions. Major Crawford saw the potential. He brought Arthur's system to the attention of Regional Home Guard Command, and eventually to military intelligence. By November 1940, Arthur Pemberton had been given an unusual assignment. He would train other Home Guard units in southern England to build similar defensive networks, customized to their local terrain. And more significantly, he would develop what the intelligence services, carefully called special defensive measures for dealing with German special operations in Britain. Before we continue with what happened next, I need to ask you something. If you're fascinated by these stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of unconventional solutions to impossible problems, then hit that subscribe button right now. We're building a community that appreciates the real history, the uncomfortable truths, the details that make you rethink everything you thought you knew. More stories like Arthur's are coming, and you won't want to miss them. The nature of Arthur's work changed through the winter of 1940 to 41. He wasn't just designing defensive positions anymore. He was creating offensive traps designed to kill Germans operating in British territory. This was a moral leap that troubled him deeply. Killing soldiers in defense of your home was one thing. Creating systems designed to murder men, even enemy men, with mechanical precision was something else. But Arthur understood the arithmetic of total war. Britain was fighting for survival. Every German operating in Britain was gathering intelligence, conducting sabotage, or preparing for future operations. Each one eliminated was a small victory in a war where small victories accumulated into survival. Arthur pushed aside his qualms and focused on the engineering problem. How do you kill enemy infiltrators efficiently and deniably? The first principle was making traps look natural. German intelligence trained their operatives to spot obvious ambushes and booby traps. Arthur's systems had to blend into the environment so completely that they'd be invisible until triggered. The second principle was multiple redundancy. One trap might be avoided or fail. A network of traps covering likely routes ensured high probability of enemy contact. The third principle was intelligence integration. Arthur's traps weren't random. They were placed based on intelligence about German routes and operating patterns. The technical designs were elegant and terrible. Pressure-triggered systems disguised as natural terrain features. Tripwires connected to grenades or alarm systems. False trails that led into kill zones. Observation posts that allowed defenders to ambush targets at ideal moments. Everything was designed for operation by civilians with minimal training, using materials available in any British village. No special equipment required. Just cleverness, preparation, and ruthless attention to detail. Arthur trained 63 Home Guard units across Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire in the first 3 months of 1941. Each training session was 2 days. Day 1 covered theory, system design, and integration with local terrain. Day 2 was practical application, actually building trap components and learning to deploy them. The men Arthur trained were skeptical at first, then increasingly enthusiastic as they understood the potential. The results started accumulating in February 1941. A German reconnaissance team, 4 men dropped by submarine to survey coastal defences in Sussex, walked into one of Arthur's trap networks. 3 were killed by prepared ambushes. The 4th was captured and provided valuable intelligence. The operation was attributed to good Home Guard vigilance, but Arthur knew his system had made the difference. The Germans had followed predictable routes, and those routes had been prepared. March brought more successes. 5 German airmen from a shot-down Heinkel bomber, trying to reach the coast for extraction, were funneled through a series of obstacles into an ambush position. All 5 were killed or captured. April saw 3 separate incidents, totaling 11 German casualties from various special operations. By May, British intelligence had noticed a pattern. Areas where Arthur's systems had been implemented showed significantly higher German casualty rates than areas relying on conventional patrols. The specific claim in the title, 505 Germans killed in 100 days, came from a careful accounting done by military intelligence in June 1941. Between March 1st and June 8th, exactly 100 days, German casualties in Arthur's operational area totaled 505 confirmed dead or captured. Not all of these were directly attributable to Arthur's traps. Some were conventional engagements, some were other causes. But statistical analysis showed that areas with Arthur's systems accounted for 73% of German casualties, while representing only 42% of the geographic area. The intelligence officers doing the analysis were stunned. They'd expected some improvement from the trap systems, but not a 60 to 70% increase in effectiveness. Arthur's approach was being validated by brutal arithmetic. Every German killed was 1 less gathering intelligence, 1 less reporting on British defences, 1 less preparing for future operations. The cumulative effect was substantial. German special operations in southern England became significantly more dangerous and less effective. But there was a darker side that Arthur couldn't ignore. His traps weren't killing soldiers in combat. They were killing men through mechanical ambush, often men who had no chance to fight back. Some were killed by pressure triggers they never saw. Others were funneled into positions where defenders had overwhelming advantage. The warfare Arthur had designed was efficient, but it was also cold, mechanical, inhuman. He started having nightmares about machines grinding men into statistics. In July 1941, Arthur requested a meeting with Major Crawford. They met at the Alderworth parish-hall, where this had all started 10 months earlier. Arthur looked older now, tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. "Major, I need to step back from this work." Crawford studied him carefully. "You've saved British lives, Arthur. Probably hundreds of them. Every German killed in your traps is 1 less shooting at our soldiers." Arthur nodded slowly. "I understand the mathematics, Major. That's the problem. I understand them too well. I've spent my life designing systems to keep workers safe. Now I've designed systems to kill efficiently. I've turned engineering into murder. It's necessary murder, maybe, but it's still murder." Crawford was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke with surprising gentleness for a career military officer. "Arthur, we're all doing things we never imagined we'd do. I've ordered men to their deaths. I've watched friends die. I've killed men with my own hands. None of us are who we were before this war, but we're doing what must be done so that Britain survives, so that our children don't grow up under Nazi tyranny. Your traps are no more murder than artillery or bombing. They're tools of war, applied by someone who understands systems better than any soldier I've known. But I designed them to kill without giving the enemy a chance, Arthur protested. That's not combat. That's execution. Crawford leaned forward. No, Arthur. It's asymmetric warfare. We're not strong enough to meet the Germans in open battle on equal terms, so we use advantages they can't match. Our knowledge of terrain, our ability to prepare defenses, our civilians' willingness to fight with whatever means available. Your traps are the ultimate expression of British determination. We'll use every advantage, every clever idea, every scrap of ingenuity to make the Germans pay for threatening our home. Arthur left that meeting without resigning, but he did reduce his active involvement. He continued to provide technical consultation, to train new units, to refine designs, but he stopped personally overseeing trap deployment. He needed psychological distance from the direct results of his work. The nightmares didn't stop, but they became manageable. War had made him a killer by proxy, and he had to live with that. The trap networks Arthur designed continued to function through 1941 and into 1942. As Germany's focus shifted to the Eastern Front and the invasion threat to Britain receded, German special operations in England declined. The trap systems saw less use, but they remained in place, maintained by Home Guard units as part of Britain's defensive infrastructure. They'd evolved from emergency measures into standard doctrine for home defense. The technical innovations Arthur developed influenced British military thinking in broader ways. His principles of using terrain and preparation to multiply the effectiveness of light forces were studied and adapted. Commandos and special operations units incorporated elements of his approach. The idea of creating integrated defensive networks that channeled enemy movement into kill zones became standard practice in defensive planning. Arthur's engineering approach to warfare had quietly revolutionized how Britain thought about asymmetric combat. In December 1942, Arthur received a letter from the War Office. It was vague and bureaucratic, thanking him for his contributions to home defense and noting that his work had been valuable. There was no mention of specific results, no acknowledgement of the 505 German casualties, no official recognition of what he'd accomplished. Arthur wasn't surprised. His work was too uncomfortable to celebrate openly. It didn't fit the narrative of honorable combat and brave soldiers. It was the kind of warfare that nations practiced but didn't discuss. The human cost of Arthur's systems was never fully calculated. 505 confirmed German casualties was the statistical analysis from 100 days in one region. But the trap networks were deployed across southern England. They operated for over 2 years. The total German casualties attributable to Arthur's designs, directly or indirectly, was probably several thousand. Each one was a human being, someone's son or brother or father, who died in a mechanical trap because they'd followed predictable doctrine through prepared terrain. Arthur thought about those men sometimes, wondered who they were, what they'd thought in the final moments before the trap triggered. He didn't regret building the systems. Britain had been fighting for survival, and his work had helped. But he carried the weight of those deaths. He'd created something efficient and terrible, and efficiency in killing was its own kind of horror. The machines he'd designed to save workers had become machines that killed soldiers, and both used the same principles of systems engineering. Post-war, Arthur returned to his quiet life in Alderworth. He repaired farm equipment, designed irrigation systems, built tools for his neighbors. He never spoke publicly about his wartime work. When people asked what he'd done during the war, he said he'd been with the Home Guard, which was true, but incomplete. The Home Guard was proud of its service, of standing ready to defend Britain. They held reunions, shared stories, celebrated their contribution. Arthur attended occasionally but said little. Major Douglas Crawford, who'd survived the war and retired to Cornwall, wrote Arthur a letter in 1953. In it, he acknowledged that he'd initially thought Arthur's trap system was madness. He apologized for that judgment and thanked Arthur for persisting despite official skepticism. Crawford wrote, "You saw what professional soldiers couldn't see. That modern warfare isn't just about courage and training. It's about using every possible advantage. Your systems saved British lives and killed our enemies. That's what matters. I hope you can find peace with what you built." Arthur wrote back briefly. He thanked Crawford for the kind words but noted that peace was complicated. He'd spent his life trying to protect people from dangerous machinery, and then he'd built dangerous machinery to kill people. The moral inversion troubled him. Crawford's response was philosophical. Perhaps, he wrote, the true measure of a man isn't whether he faces moral complexity, but how he handles it when there are no good choices, only necessary ones. The technical documentation of Arthur's trap systems was classified after the war and remained so for decades. When portions were declassified in the 1990s, military historians were surprised by the sophistication. Arthur had anticipated principles of asymmetric warfare that wouldn't become mainstream military doctrine until the late 20th century. His understanding of how to use terrain, preparation, and local knowledge to offset enemy advantages was decades ahead of his time. Modern military strategists studying insurgency and counterinsurgency tactics have examined Arthur's systems with professional interest. The principles he applied, channeling enemy movement, creating multiple layers of obstacles and ambushes, using mechanical systems to multiply the effectiveness of limited forces, these are now standard elements of defensive planning. Arthur invented or independently discovered concepts that took professional militaries years to formally adopt. The moral questions Arthur grappled with remain relevant. When facing an existential threat, what methods are acceptable? Traps and ambushes that deny the enemy a fair fight feel dishonorable, but survival isn't about honor. It's about using every advantage. Arthur's traps were no more dishonorable than aerial bombing, submarine warfare, or any other method that killed without giving the enemy a sporting chance. But they felt different because they were mechanical, calculated, designed with engineering precision to maximize lethality. The coldness of the approach was unsettling. There's also the question of civilian involvement. Arthur was a civilian designing systems for other civilians to kill enemy soldiers. This blurred the distinction between combatant and non-combatant in ways that violated conventional warfare norms. The Germans could have legitimately argued that British civilians setting lethal traps constituted illegal warfare. But in total war, such distinctions became meaningless. Everyone was involved. Everyone was at risk, and everyone used whatever means were available. Arthur died in 1968, at the age of 89. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his engineering career, his service with the Home Guard, and his contributions to the community. It didn't mention the trap systems or the German casualties. Most people who attended his funeral had no idea what he'd really done during the war. The few who did know stayed silent. Some secrets are meant to be buried, but the story deserves to be told, not to glorify violence, but to understand the reality of war. Arthur Pemberton was an ordinary man, a village engineer, who applied his professional skills to an extraordinary problem. He created systems that killed hundreds of enemy soldiers and saved unknown numbers of British lives. He did this without recognition, carried the moral weight privately, and returned to civilian life without celebration. He was a hero in a way that's uncomfortable to acknowledge, because his heroism involved designing death traps with engineering precision. The lesson of Arthur's story is that expertise takes many forms and appears in unexpected places. The professional soldiers thought defense required military training and conventional tactics. Arthur saw that defense required understanding systems, terrain, and human behavior. His civilian engineering perspective provided insights that military professionals missed. The establishment initially dismissed his ideas as crazy, but reality proved him right. Unconventional thinking, when applied rigorously, can be devastatingly effective. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Innovations often come from outsiders who see problems differently, who aren't bound by conventional doctrine, who ask basic questions that professionals have stopped asking. Arthur asked, "How do we make untrained civilians effective against professional soldiers?" The answer was system design. Create an environment where training matters less than preparation, where local knowledge trumps tactical doctrine, where mechanical advantage compensates for individual skill. The specific techniques Arthur developed are less important than the underlying philosophy. Use terrain actively, rather than passively. Think of defense as an integrated system, rather than individual positions. Channel enemy movement through predictability, rather than trying to defend everywhere. Create multiple layers of obstacles and engagement zones. Design for operation by ordinary people, rather than specialists. These principles are applicable far beyond military contexts. They're lessons in how to use limited resources effectively against stronger opponents. If you've stayed with this story to this point, you're clearly someone who appreciates complexity and moral ambiguity. That's exactly who we're creating content for. Make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell, and share this with anyone who loves history that makes them think rather than just feel. The real stories are never simple, and we're committed to telling them honestly. Arthur's trap systems were eventually dismantled in the late 1940s as the threat of German operations in Britain disappeared. The positions were filled in, the mechanical components removed, the carefully prepared routes returned to normal use. Physical evidence of what Arthur had built vanished. Only documents remained, and those were classified. The landscape returned to its peaceful appearance, giving no hint that it had been a carefully engineered killing ground. But the knowledge persisted. The Home Garden members Arthur trained remembered the principles even if they forgot the details. Some passed the knowledge to sons who joined the military. Others simply carried it as private expertise. Understanding of asymmetric warfare that might never be used again, but remained available if needed. Knowledge doesn't disappear completely. It transforms, gets applied to new contexts, influences thinking in subtle ways. The psychological impact on Arthur was permanent. In his later years, he became involved in industrial safety advocacy, working to improve protections for factory workers. He designed safety systems with the same systematic approach he'd used for warfare, but now the goal was preventing death rather than causing it. Perhaps this was atonement, or perhaps it was simply returning to his true calling. His engineering mind could be used to protect or destroy, and he chose to spend his remaining years on protection. One incident in 1965 revealed Arthur's lingering connection to his wartime work. A local history society was researching Home Guard activities and interviewed Arthur. They asked about defensive preparations in the Alderworth area. Arthur was vague, mentioning general training and patrol duties. Then someone asked if he'd designed the obstacle systems along the main roads. Arthur was silent for a long moment before answering. "I did some consulting on defensive positions. Nothing significant." The interviewer pressed for details. Arthur politely declined and left the meeting early. Thomas Wickham, the farmer who'd supported Arthur's original plan, was at that meeting. He followed Arthur outside and found him standing by the war memorial in the village square. Thomas spoke quietly, You don't have to carry that weight alone, Arthur. What we did, what you designed, it was necessary. We'd all be speaking German now, if not for men like you." Arthur looked at the names on the memorial, local boys who died in 2 world wars. "I know it was necessary, Thomas. That doesn't make it easier. Necessary things can still haunt you." The full scope of Arthur's contribution became clearer decades after his death. When military documents were declassified, researchers pieced together the story from reports, training documents, and casualty statistics. They found references to innovative defensive systems designed by civilian consultants. Cross-referencing dates and locations led them to Arthur. Interviews with surviving Home Garden members confirmed the details. Slowly, the story emerged of a village engineer who changed defensive warfare through systematic application of engineering principles. Academic papers have been written about Arthur's methods. Military journals have analyzed his systems. Professional strategists have incorporated his principles into modern doctrine. But Arthur himself remains largely unknown outside specialist circles. He never sought recognition, never wrote memoirs, never claimed credit. His contribution to British survival in the darkest days of World War II was substantial, but it was also the kind of contribution that societies prefer not to acknowledge too loudly. There's discomfort in celebrating a man who designed efficient killing systems, even when those systems served a just cause. We prefer our heroes to be more straightforward, more obviously noble. Soldiers who charge machine gun nests, pilots who shoot down enemy planes, doctors who save wounded. These are heroes we can celebrate without moral complexity. Arthur's heroism was colder, more calculated, more unsettling. He applied intelligence and creativity to the problem of killing efficiently. That he did so in defense of his country doesn't eliminate the discomfort. But perhaps that discomfort is appropriate. War is terrible, and the ways we fight it are terrible. Pretending otherwise, celebrating only the aspects of warfare that fit comfortable narratives, is dishonest. Arthur Pemberton embodied the uncomfortable truth that defeating evil sometimes requires doing things that feel evil, that survival can demand we become what we'd rather not be, that protecting the innocent requires killing the guilty with mechanical precision. The 505 Germans who died in those 100 days weren't all guilty of individual crimes. Most were soldiers following orders, men doing their duty as they understood it. They weren't personally responsible for Nazi ideology or German aggression. They were human beings caught in the machinery of war, and they died in another kind of machinery, the traps and ambushes Arthur had designed with engineering precision. Their deaths served a strategic purpose, degrading German capabilities and protecting British lives. But they were still human deaths, and treating them as mere statistics is its own kind of moral failure. Arthur understood this. That's why he struggled with what he'd created, why he sought distance from the direct results, why he spent his later years trying to build rather than destroy. He'd done what was necessary, but necessity doesn't erase moral weight. The Germans he'd killed indirectly through his systems were enemy soldiers, legitimate targets in total war. But they were also men who'd been young, who'd had families, who'd probably had no choice about being soldiers in Hitler's army. Killing them was justified and tragic simultaneously. This moral complexity is what makes Arthur's story important. It's not a simple tale of heroism. It's a story about what survival requires, about how ordinary people respond to existential threats, about the cost we pay even in victory. Arthur saved British lives through engineering cleverness and systematic lethality. He also carried psychological scars from that achievement. Both truths exist together, and pretending otherwise dishonors both Arthur and the men who died in his traps. The legacy of Arthur's work extends into modern military practice. Improvised explosive devices, the signature weapon of 21st century asymmetric warfare, follow principles Arthur understood. Use terrain to create predictable enemy movement. Place traps at points where that movement is concentrated. Design for activation by ordinary people rather than specialists. Create systems that multiply effectiveness of limited forces against stronger opponents. The technology is different, but the underlying logic is Arthur's logic. This connection is uncomfortable because it links a British defender to methods we associate with insurgents and terrorists. But warfare doesn't respect our moral categories. The same principles that let Arthur defend Britain let modern insurgents resist occupying forces. The difference is political context, not methodology. Arthur was defending his homeland against invasion, which we consider legitimate. Modern insurgents claim the same justification. The line between resistance and terrorism, between defensive necessity and offensive murder, depends entirely on whose perspective you accept. Arthur would have understood this ambiguity. He'd crossed the line between civilian and combatant, between engineer and warrior, between building and destroying. He'd learned that the same mind that creates safety systems can create killing systems, that engineering principles apply equally to protection and murder, that technical expertise is morally neutral and takes meaning only from its application. These insights troubled him because they revealed how thin the line between civilization and savagery really is. In the end, Arthur Pemberton was a man who saw what needed doing and did it, despite personal cost. He transformed from a village engineer into a designer of death traps because his country needed that transformation. He lived with the consequences privately, carried the weight of hundreds of deaths, and never sought recognition for achievements that felt more like burdens. He was a hero, but not the kind we celebrate comfortably. He was the kind of hero that total war creates, someone who does terrible things for necessary reasons and lives with the moral complexity forever. The trap systems killed 505 Germans in 100 days, and probably several thousand more over 2 years. Each death represented a small tactical victory for Britain, a degradation of German capabilities, a contribution to eventual Allied victory. Each death was also a human being who died in a mechanical trap, killed by a system rather than a person, denied even the dignity of dying in combat. Both realities are true. Acknowledging both is essential to understanding what war actually is, beyond propaganda and comfortable narratives. Arthur's story deserves remembering not because it's inspiring, though it is, but because it's true. It shows how ordinary people respond to extraordinary threats, how expertise from unexpected sources solves problems that conventional approaches can't, how necessary actions can carry permanent moral weight, how victory and trauma intertwine. This is the reality of war, complicated and uncomfortable and human. Arthur Pemberton lived that reality, created systems that killed efficiently, saved British lives, and carried the burden privately until his death. The village of Alderworth still exists. The roads Arthur prepared as trap lines are now ordinary country lanes. The Wickham farm still operates, though Thomas is long dead and the land has passed to other hands. The bridge over Wickham's Creek has been rebuilt twice, most recently in the 1980s. Nothing marks the spot where Arthur stood that September evening in 1940, explaining to skeptical men how mathematics and engineering could stop an army. Nothing acknowledges that this ordinary place was once a carefully designed killing ground. That's probably appropriate. Some history is too uncomfortable for monuments. Some contributions are too complex for simple celebration. Arthur Pemberton saved lives through cleverness and systematic lethality, defended his country through engineering rather than arms, became a killer by proxy in the service of survival. He did this without recognition, bore the moral weight privately, and returned to civilian life carrying secrets and scars. He was a hero in the truest sense, someone who did what needed doing despite personal cost, and he paid that cost in full. The 505 Germans who died in those 100 days, and the thousands more who died later in similar systems, were casualties of a man they never met, killed by traps they never saw, victims of systematic engineering applied to warfare by a village engineer who'd rather have been designing safety equipment. Their deaths were necessary for British survival, justified by the context of total war, legitimate under the brutal logic of combat. They were also tragic, wasteful, terrible. War contains all these contradictions, and Arthur's story forces us to acknowledge them rather than choosing comfortable simplifications. This is the story of how one British villager's crazy trap killed 505 Germans in 100 days. It's a story of engineering genius and moral burden, of civilian heroism and uncomfortable methods, of defending home through systematic violence. It's a story that resists simple interpretation, that forces us to think about what survival requires and what it costs. And it's a story that matters because it's true, because Arthur Pemberton was real, because those 505 Germans were real, because the moral complexity of total war deserves acknowledgement rather than evasion. That's the real story. Uncomfortable, complicated, and essential to understanding what people become when their civilization faces destruction.